The latest news, national issues, the political scene, and conversations with prominent personalities. All these firsthand at the forefront. Good morning. I am Attorney Karen Jimeno. The trust and approval ratings of President Bongbong Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte declined in both Numero and Pulse Asia surveys. International news agencies like Bloomberg reported that VP Duterte's ratings had a major decline after she publicly lambasted the president. Meanwhile, Publicus came out with its latest senatorial preferences survey, with several presidential senatorial bets making it to the top 12. What does this all mean? And is the president and the public perception of President Marcos and VP Duterte affected by this year's events? To help us understand and analyze the latest surveys, live at the BNC studio is the head of the UST Political Science Department, Professor Torre. Good morning, Professor Eric.
Good morning, Attorney Karen. Good to see you and good to have you in your program.
So let's start with Numero. It's a relatively new public opinion research firm since it was only established 4 years ago. How reliable is Numero?
Well, of course, Numero is a reputable firm. But again, in any other approach when we intend to go about it is that the approach or the manner by which how they conducted actually the survey. Some firms, they do, for example, Pulse, SWS, they do the traditional approach wherein they go face-to-face, they interact with people, and then they use specifically survey instruments. But other firms, for that matter, they go also online. They use basically big data in terms of the analytics, in terms of voter preference as well. So you can relatively see a shift in terms of dynamics, in terms of how preference, in terms of their perceived candidate will be for this 2025 elections.
And what is big data?
So when we say big data is that reliability in terms of the number of likes, the number of emojis, the engagement basically with these particular candidates. And you use basically a big amount of data for you to be able to harness that preference in terms of interface with such users.
So are you saying that now survey firms also use big data? It's not just what we traditionally know as being asked, do you prefer or do you approve of the president or the vice president? Ngayon, they also look at big data,
Yes.
which would be the reactions online.
Yes.
Does it
Attorney
capture
Karen.
comments, like negative and
It
positive
does,
comments?
it does. But however, Attorney Karen, in terms of in the academe or in the social sciences, it's not really that reliable because there are no studies yet that would say that, for example, the number of emojis and likes is already convertible into votes in terms of their preferences.
Yeah.
Secondly is that, of course, in the advent of AI and some programs or, for example, some apps, you cannot really say that, for example, 1,000 likes or emojis are really coming from, an actual person.
Yeah, and
So,
this is where trolling also plays a role.
yes. So at the end of the day, the traditional approach in terms of the face-to-face methodology is still the very much generally accepted approach in the academe or in the social sciences when you do surveys.
Which is the face-to-face surveys.
Yes.
And right now, there was 1,729 respondents for Numero, as opposed to the 2,400 respondents of the latest Pulse Asia survey.
Yeah.
Does that affect the reliability of a survey?
No, the reliability would be would vary in terms of the plus or minus, for example, approval ratings of both candidates. Secondly, the standard actually is 1,200 to 1,600. So that would depend now on the plus or minus reliability in terms of how they actually conducted the said survey.
Yeah, so having more respondents doesn't necessarily increase the accuracy if, for example, the randomization is not as good
Yes.
compared to at the 1,000, for example.
Yes, yes, attorney.
So for those watching or like reading a survey, when you see the number of respondents, it doesn't necessarily translate right away to
Yes.
more accuracy.
Yes. And at the same time, attorney, the approach we're in, there's also targeted approach. There's also a random sampling. So these are very important considerations in terms of how a firm actually conduct their survey for that matter.
So does it vary per survey firm, or is there nationally or internationally accepted standard that they must observe?
Well, in terms of the number of respondents, the gold standard is actually 1 to 1,600. So they have to, the more, it doesn't necessarily mean that it really captures. That would depend, again, as what I have said, on the approach in terms of the plus or minus reliability of how they intended, working on the said firm, and the duration as well.
And the WR Numero conducted trust and approval ratings in September and saw a decline for both President Bongbong Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte. But we can see that what's consistent there would be for Metro Manila, the President had higher approval ratings in Metro Manila and Luzon compared to Vice President Sara Duterte. But Visayas, overwhelmingly, the approval ratings are in favor of Vice President Sara Duterte. In fact, in Mindanao, there's a huge discrepancy where Vice President Sara has a 69% approval rating, whereas President Bongbong Marcos only had 24%. So what do you make of these results?
Well, definitely that would be a factor in terms of where both candidates actually came from. So we all know for a fact that Vice President Sara Duterte came from the Visayas, had a very huge support from the Visayas and the Mindanao bloc. Understandably, the President coming from the north would give us an idea that, steadily, Luzon, and of course, the focal point of how we intend to go about such is, Metro Manila, which is actually one of the primordial consideration in terms of their perception towards these two leaders of our country.
And a 2028 presidential preference survey by WR Numero had VP Sara and Raffy Tulfo tied at 24% for president in 2028. Do you think that this could be sustained, or do you think that this is already a drop? As you see here, Sara Duterte dropped by 5% and it was, it dropped by 5 in terms of ranking, and then Raffy Tulfo up by 3. Is that, okay, something I want you to explain to me, because I have no background, of course, in reading political surveys. The decline in 5, is that percentage or is that in terms of position?
That's actually in terms of both percentage and probably that would depend on how they were able to use what particular methodology, but that would mean the percentage, attorney.
Yung 5,
yes.
and then the 3 is an increase by 3%
Yes.
for Senator Raffy Tulfo.
For that matter, of course, the another consideration would be the event or the time where they conducted the survey. For example, if there is a very challenging times in terms of both issues that would highlight, especially right now, the relationship between the president and the vice president. So when a firm actually conducts a survey, this would be all taken into context. So that would affect now the perception of the people in terms of their choosing of the said candidates.
Okay. So I think, from what I understand, when the survey was conducted for these potential presidential votes in 2028, this was before impeachment complaints were filed against Vice President Sara.
Yes.
So do you think if it were conducted after the impeachment complaints were filed, after the Quadcom hearings were concluded, do you think that we would see a difference in the numbers?
Oh, most definitely. And I think the manner by which the heated issues is especially during the December time. Like, for example, if I'm not mistaken, second to third week of December. So that's really the most pressing time for both the president and the vice president. Of course, definitely it would significantly affect voters' preference because of their perception and towards what they are actually getting from the media for that matter, the information that they get.
And also in the WR Numero's 2028 presidential survey, you have, as you can see here, former Vice President Leni Robredo, Senators Grace Poe, Amy Marcos, Senator Risa Ontiveros, former Senator Manny Pacquiao, Robin Padilla, and Martin Romualdez, Speaker Martin Romualdez, also in the list. Do you see a potential dark horse from this list, or anyone that is a potential dark horse that's not in this list?
And this is just me, and the potential dark horse really is, of course, Raffy Tulfo. If you notice, is
Dark horse pa ba siya? He's like always topping the surveys.
But if you notice, he's the only person who had an increase. So if you notice, most of them significantly had dropped down. But he's gaining momentum. But in any conduct of elections, the fundamental challenge is how do you sustain Attorney Karen? How will you be able to pick? Because in politics, everything is all about timing. And the fundamental concern now is if you're peaking, how not to reach that plateau in terms of your momentum as a candidate or as a potential candidate.
Well, in the last senatorial elections, Senator Robin Padilla ranked number 1 among all the other candidates. Do you think he's a potential dark horse?
Not entirely, because Attorney Karen, in a senatorial position, you have 12. But as we always explained, if the position is on one-on-one basis, that would significantly affect your numbers. Number one, you have to consider your base votes, where you actually came from. So those are things that you have to actually factor in. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you're the number 1 senator, you have the potential to be vice president and president. So that significantly changed through the years in terms of understanding as such. For example, former President Rodrigo Duterte he came out of nowhere. When
I remember the first time I even saw his name for the presidential candidates.
Yes.
He was, I think, at 4%.
Yes, and he gained momentum through time. So, and he's not even a senator, he was a local chief executive. Even, for example, former Vice President Jejomar Binay, who are actually, local chief executive. So the dynamics actually, Attorney Karen, change in terms of how we view that. Before, traditionally, senators number 1, number 2 would become a barometer for them to run for higher office.
And we're seeing here in the background also the change in the survey results back when the fieldwork dates were November to December 2023. So this was around this time last year. And you see how far ahead Vice President Sara was. She was at 35.6%,
Yes.
Raffy Tulfo at 22.5%. So how do you account for the events of 2024 in terms of affecting the chances of Vice President Sara for the 2028 presidential elections?
Yeah, very challenging times, especially, again, as what I have said, during the November to December. This is very challenging times on the part of the Vice President because of several issues that confronted her. So, for example, you have the Quadcom hearings. Of course, there are lots of issues that, again, the narrative is that how would she be able to explain the confidential funds, the misuse of this confidential fund. So it affects the people's perception really. And if you look at it now, there is a steady decline on the numbers of the Vice President.
So do you foresee that decline to continue?
Well, that would depend now on the succeeding months. Again, it's still too early to tell because it's only 2025. But of course, if this would, translate into a far more serious challenge, especially there's a third impeachment complaint filed against her. So that would significantly change. But also, it could work both ways. It could also mean that there would be sympathy on the part of the Vice President. So again, but one thing is for sure, it significantly affects the perception of the people towards the Vice President.
Well, Vice President Sara Duterte has mentioned in the past that this is all a demolition job against her, the Quadcom hearings, the budget hearings. If that were true, since we saw a decline in her numbers, would you say that having that demolition job was effective?
Well, it's a very challenging question. But one thing is for sure, I think the people are actually, waiting. Is that the explanation of the Vice President? How did she actually use the said, fund? But of course, it will not be an intelligence fund for nothing if you will actually divulge how it was actually used. But there's actually, people are actually thinking that how were you able to spend that much, amount of budget in a certain period of time? So it creates basically doubt that affects her credibility as a Vice President. Plus, of course, her pronouncements. Well, of course, it's given because I think it's the character is really more of the the Duterte brand.
So you mean the pronouncements against the president?
Against the president, and of course the office as well, for that matter. So these are all form part of how people affects their perception towards the Vice President.
Did you think Vice President Sara made the mistake of announcing her intention to run in 2028 too early?
Well, of course, it's the same mistake as before, like what Vice President Binay before, that he actually, declared too early as his intentions to run for the president. But of course, given that there will be plots, there will be challenges that other parties would be prepared of.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier that it's also not surprising the way Vice President Sara made pronouncements against the president because it's part of their character or the Duterte branding. But as we see here, or including from international news outlets like Bloomberg, they said that her approval rating went down because, and they connect this when she started lambasting the president.
Yes.
Do you think that the Duterte brand is waning, or do you think this works for former President Duterte but not necessarily for Vice President Sara Duterte, this style of aggression?
Actually, that's a very good point, Attorney Karen. Former President Duterte is very much, different as compared to VP Sara. But one thing is for sure, it's the Duterte brand of both. However, there's still, in my view, is that there's still this, people's perception towards, how the president is actually very formal. Whenever they get to criticize him, lambast him, he's just very, very formal in terms of not really into the said issue, not to engage with the Vice President. So I think that gives points, good points on the part of the President. However, on the other side, it also affects his leadership, for that matter, in terms of addressing, several issues. But again, it affects how the Vice President lambasts the President.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Eric, as you said, the style of President Bongbong Marcos is not to react. He's very calm. But we still saw in the latest survey results for approval ratings that his approval ratings also declined. So what does this say about Filipinos in general? Because you have someone who refuses to comment, but his approval ratings also went down. And then a vice president who's very aggressive, but also her approval ratings went down. How do we make sense of this?
So for the president, for that matter, is that I think it's addressing serious issues and concerns right now on the part of the country. High inflation, poverty incidence is very high. These are the economic challenge that we are actually facing right now.
So you're saying it goes beyond the verbal
It goes beyond the
exchanges?
verbal,
Okay.
yeah. And people are the Filipino people. I think we're waiting for that. Okay, what's the roadmap? How do we improve, or how will this administration better improve the quality of the lives of each and every Filipino? So I think that's the more pressing challenge right now on the part of the administration and part of the president. It goes beyond what they have conflict with the vice president.
And up next, we have Professor Dennis Coronacion joining us with Professor Eric Torre. At the Forefront will return after a short break.
Two reasons why. I think the first one is I come from a rice farming background in Ilocos Norte. I have relatives that does rice farming and really saw the complexities that they saw every single day. And second is really my immersion in Singapore. Earlier this year, I went to Singapore and I interned for a startup that helped shrimp farmers manage the risks of disease testing in Vietnam. So having to understand that risks is the biggest, most vulnerable factors that affect farming, I tried to apply that in the Philippines, and AgriConnect came to be.
Good evening, I'm Pinky Webb. Tonight we ask the questions, what does the investigation cover? We tackle the issues,
The president's immunity from suit is absolute.
we clarify matters, and we get on point.
Watch his press con. Sinabi niya na ayaw niya ng kudita.
What is questionable about the AR, sir? The Vice President keeps insisting walang active threat kung hindi ako mamamatay.
Tignan na lang natin, mahirap pang pangunahan eh.
Pinky Webb on point. Beauty, health, adventure. This is for you. Join Marie Lozano where she uncovers the untold stories and unexpected surprises in the world of lifestyle.
We wanted to create a space where we could dive into these topics not just by talking to experts, but experiencing the topics firsthand. Let me tell you about the Lifestyle Lab.
On PNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.
Welcome back at the Forefront. And joining Professor Eric to also share his insights on the recent survey results, we have the head of the UST Political Science Department, Professor Dennis Coronacion. Good morning, Professor Dennis.
Good morning, Atty. Karen.
So we're having interesting conversations here about the latest survey results from different survey firms. But let's go to Pulse Asia. Pulse Asia is one of the older ones. It's been in existence since 1999. But back in 2009, there were SEC documents that showed it had ties with Tony Boy Cojuangco in terms of ownership. Did that affect the public perception of the reliability of Pulse Asia?
Well, of course, whenever there are survey firms that are being established, people always look at who are the owners. They always ask that question. And of course, they're going to connect whether or not it's going to affect the if a survey firm is going to be objective or not. And I think for the longest time, Pulse Asia has been one of the more objective survey firms, along with SWS, and of course we have the new ones recently established, Numero and Octa. But I don't think that the connection of Pulse Asia with one of the owners, Tony Boy Cojuangco, is going to affect its survey results.
Yeah, I haven't seen the SEC documents recently as of late. I don't know if there's still links to Mr. Tony Boy Cojuangco, but there were accusations back in also recent years that Pulse Asia was used as a propaganda tool by pro-Duterte groups. Do you know what is the basis for that type of accusation?
Well, I'm not really very familiar with the accusation, but I suppose all survey firms are susceptible to that. They're prone to being accused of, being affiliated with a certain public personality or.
If you're doing well in their surveys, perhaps.
If you're doing well, of course, you're not going to criticize the results. But if you're not doing well in the survey in the survey results, then the logical reaction is that you're going to criticize and you're going to look for an excuse as to why you're not doing well.
And when the results of two surveys are aligned, does that confirm the accuracy of the surveys? Recently, the Pulse Asia results are quite similar to WR Numero Uno's latest surveys.
That's right. If the result of if the results of a survey firm coincides with the result of another survey firm, that somehow strengthens the findings. But I think not all of them have the same findings.
Yes.
There are some that differ from the more established ones.
Yes, and later we're going to talk about the senatorial surveys because I think a lot of the difference right now is in the senatorial surveys among the recent survey results that came out. But has there been instances in the past where the trust and approval ratings more or less remain consistent? Because earlier, Professor Eric and I were talking about the recent approval ratings and for both the president and vice president, their approval ratings declined. But in the past, were there instances where the approval ratings were consistent?
Well, if there's anything consistent with this, the current results, with the latest results, although they differ in numbers, the exact numbers, but they're the same in terms of the pattern. They're all saying that the latest is that both the president and the vice president, their numbers have declined, their approval rating and their trust rating. In the past, it's maybe it's possible. I just can't recall an exact period in which the trust rating and the approval rating of the president as well as the vice president conflicted with each other.
Well, for the former President Duterte's approval ratings, I think during his term, they remained relatively high. Would you remember this, Professor Eric?
Yeah. If you noticed, especially it was only during the time of the pandemic that his numbers actually declined. But after which the economy and we're opening up, he when he went out of office, it was actually, if I'm not mistaken, 80 to 82%. So that's relatively high for a outgoing president.
I remember before we had President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. By the time she was also an outgoing president, her approval rating was very low, but I can't remember the numbers. Would you?
Yeah.
That's right. By the time that she was about to go out of office, she was very unpopular. Yeah, her numbers had gone down, except for I think former President Duterte. Despite the fact that his survey numbers had gone down, he remained, I think, above the 50% majority. And that was a surprise because people thought that since he was, many thought that he's what do you call this? Solutions to the pandemic were not as effective. So many thought that he was going to go out as a unpopular president, but he remained in the 50% mark.
So would you say that for surveys, especially when it comes to approval ratings, do they really have a correlation with the performance of the public officers that are being surveyed, are being part of the survey?
Yeah, of course. Since people base their perceptions on what they have been hearing about these public personalities or public officials, so they do have an impact on on what people think about these public officials.
And Professor Eric, because of that, do you think that it's sufficient to have your work also explain properly to the people, but when it comes to not just your performance, but what you mentioned, what they hear about you, is it important to have positive news coverage?
Yeah, most definitely.
Even in this era of social media?
Yeah, especially in this era of social media, Attorney Karen, because again, it's the optics, it's the perception and how people perceive you. And sometimes there are some politicians actually who are really that good in showing that they are actually doing something well. In fact, they are not. And I think it's really more about of how people are going to be very critical in choosing the right leaders, especially right now that, in the advent of the social media, everything is possible that would depend on the narrative and the optics, Attorney Karen.
And do you account for the Tulfos leading all the surveys? So, senatorial surveys, there tends to be a difference in those that rank from number 6 or number 5 onwards. But the top, we have consistently Erwin Tulfo, Ben Tulfo, and then Tito Soto, who are all on TV. So, do you think that for Filipinos, we tend to vote for public office people who have media coverage, regardless of what that media coverage is about?
Well, not entirely, because there are some public personalities and public officials whose survey numbers largely depend on what what the media portray about them. Say, for example, a huge number of Filipinos are aware of the presence of Pastor Kibuloy, and yet a huge number of them do not want to vote for him.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about Willie Revillame? I mean, he is a very famous TV personality, but he's not ranking very high in the surveys.
I think, Attorney Karen, it's the three. The media is a plus factor, but I think the Filipino people resonates these candidates simply because of the way that they perceive them in the media, that their programs are actually public service programs.
So, like, for example, for the Tulfos,
yes,
they're very much aligned with
yes,
public survey.
Yes, public service. So,
public service.
Yes. So, if I'm a common Filipino and I get to watch them, and they're very responsive, they provide solutions basically. That's why if you notice, 'di ba, parang Attorney Karen, pagka hindi kayo tumugon, ipapatulfo ko kayo. So that's the thing. They become now a third. It somehow weakens institutions and organizations that they go directly to these personalities.
What about Willie Revillame? He gives money, so isn't that perceived as something that also helps people?
But I think he has been gone for quite some time. I think, and besides, the message, over time, I think the popularity of Willie Revillame has gone down. And plus the fact that Filipinos they're not really mindless voters. They are smart voters, wise voters. They think before they vote for someone, especially the celebrities. Because gone are the days. I remember back in the 1990s when this celebrity, politics started, Filipinos were just, mindlessly voting for these celebrities. And then they had learned over time that not all of them are actually cut out for public service.
Okay. And talking about public service, the approval ratings relate to what our incumbent officials have done. And interestingly, the Senate President and the House Speaker had contrasting results in the recent Pulse Asia survey. So we have high approval ratings for Senate President Chis Escudero, whereas the approval ratings for Speaker Martin Romualdez went down. What do you make of these contrasting results, since they are both perceived to be aligned with President Bongbong Marcos? Whoever wants to talk.
Well, of course, I think for Senate President Chis Escudero, he was just stored as the new Senate President. However, he had a good job, I think, for the past couple of months in terms of dealing with pressing issues. He's very vocal about several issues with regard to the Senate. For example, he was very vocal about charter change, and it's not a priority of the House of of the Senate, and some other issues for that matter. I think that the numbers of House Speaker Martin Romualdez significantly went down is because of course, with the conflict with the Vice President. So also there are some, social media personalities and, heavily criticize the House Speaker. And not just social media personalities, but the manner by which these issues are being, challenged to the Vice President is not actually attributed from the President, but rather to the Senate, to the House Speaker.
Okay, so do you think the decline in approval ratings for the House Speaker is related to the conflict with the Vice President?
Yes, we could say that it can be a major factor in terms of how it affected his numbers.
Well, currently, the Congress and with the leadership of Speaker Martin has been known for giving out a lot of ayuda. Do you think that did not help in terms of improving his approval ratings?
Well, the survey numbers of the speakers have always puzzled several political analysts. It seems that his numbers are unaffected by public issue or his positive action in terms of public service, whereas the Senate President is just like one of those, political leaders whose survey numbers are affected by, of course, the issues, the ongoing issues, his image, his charisma, and so on and so forth. And it always puzzles us why.
With House Speaker, you mean?
That's right. Yeah. Why?
So what does account for that? Do Filipinos look for a certain type of charisma from politicians that have nothing to do with public service or your performance? Like when it comes especially to a high position, because obviously for Speaker Martin, he gets elected to Congress. So
Yes.
when it comes to getting the vote of his district, he is able to do that. But when it comes to getting national approval, he's tried to run for Senate in the past, but didn't make it. And now when he's included in presidential surveys, he was at the bottom in the recent survey. So what is it that Filipinos look for when it comes to a presidential candidate?
Now, maybe they're looking for certain qualities for a national leader. Perhaps they're looking for someone who's approachable, someone who is possibly an underdog, someone who has an appeal to the masses. And I think those qualities are evading the House Speaker.
Are lacking or
lacking.
hindi makita ng mga Filipino
That's right.
in that. And if the midterm polls were held from November 26 to December 3, the admin senatorial slate would take 8 to 9 seats based on recent surveys. So 1 to 2 are going to be from the Duterte camp, again based on the recent survey results, and there would be 2 independent candidates. So is it correct to assume that the 2025 midterm elections would be a validation of President Bongbong Marcos's leadership, considering they're taking majority based on surveys if the elections were to be held in these past few months?
Well, most definitely, Attorney Karen, it would be a testimony on his leadership and his political capital in terms of his endorsement capacity as a president. So that reflects on the winnability of his candidates or the candidates of the said administration. So that would depend if, for example, they would be able to get all or overwhelmingly win the said 12 slots. However, given with the said placings that there are definitely 2 coming from the Duterte side and 2 possibly independent candidates.
Who are those 2 from the Duterte camp? Because I see some variances in survey results. So in some of the survey results, you have both Senator Bongo and Bato de la Rosa definitely in. But Robin Padilla is not a real electionist. So sila yung dalawa, no? And Francis Tolentino is no longer part of the Duterte camp. And what about those that are in the 10 to 15 rank? They always say that those that poll 10 to 15 in the survey results, will be fighting for the last 2 seats in the senatorial slate. So right now we have Abby Binay, Lito Lapid, Amy Marcos. Bato de la Rosa varies. Sometimes he's in the 10 to 15 range, sometimes he's in the top 1 to 9. And then what do you think are the strong contenders for these last 2 seats in the Senate slate?
I think Amy Marcos is a strong contender. I just think the reason why her number has gone down is because she's also affected by, the quarrel between the president's camp and the vice president's family, because she was caught in between. She is the sister of the president, and her loyalty, as she proclaims, is with the Duterte family. So that somehow, that kind of strategy or position somehow affects her survey numbers.
Do you think the Filipinos would prefer if she just chose a side, a clear side?
Yeah, I think so. But of course, she's not going to do that, knowing the fact that the Marcoses are not really very popular in Mindanao. And she needs a Mindanao vote. So she's trying to strike a balance between blood ties and, of course, pragmatism.
But we have seen her go down in the surveys, meaning now she's in the 10 to 15 range, whereas before she would be a bit higher. So do you think that being in the middle or trying to play both sides is a strategy that does not work?
At the moment, at the moment it's not working. Before, there was no, the quarrel between the president and the vice president was not out in the open. Yep.
What about you, Professor Eric? Who do you think is going to be in those last 2 seats from 11 to 12?
Well, I think definitely Amy Marcos will be able to make it through. Very challenging in terms of how would she be able to maintain a balance. Definitely, if she chooses a side, definitely it would affect her numbers, because if she chooses to be with the side of the administration 100%, definitely she will lose the Visayas in the Mindanao block. So it would really affect her number.
Yeah. What about who else among those in the 10 to 15 rank in the surveys do you think has a strong chance to be in the top 12?
For me, still, it would be Lapid, and I think dark horse would be Abby Binay. For me, I think she's young. She has fresh ideas, and of course, the Binay brand is actually there. And whenever you go around the country, she has a very strong awareness presence. So I think I'm looking at Abby Binay for that matter.
I found that surprising because in the past senatorial elections, I think former Vice President Jejomar Binay didn't make it, right, as a senator when he ran for Senate. And do you think the dispute between Mayor Abby Binay and her sister, Senator Nancy Binay, right now they're fighting in Makati, where Senator Nancy is running for mayor against her own brother-in-law, which is the husband of Mayor Abby Binay. Do you think that affects the chances of Abby Binay?
Well, I think Abby Binay was able to successfully made her own brand of politics. She departed from not just the Binay brand, but basically establishing her own as the mayor of Makati. So I think it doesn't really matter, but she has successfully created her own brand of leadership.
And up next, dissecting the contrasting results from the latest Publicus and Tangere survey when At the Forefront returns after a short break.
Magandang araw, Pilipinas! Plus, sa bawat issue may iba't ibang anggulo.
Sa bawat storya, may iba't ibang kwento.
Himayin natin ang bawat sulok at bawat kanto mula sa iba't ibang perspektibo na madaling maintindihan ng karaniwang mamamayan.
Every Saturday na mga magdadag to 11:30 a.m. Kaya huwag kayong papahuli mga kababayan. Manatiling may pakialam sa mga isyu sa ating bansa kung kaya samahan niyo kami. Dito lang sa Cuatro Cantos!
It has no authorization.
We hope and pray that it will not rise.
Thanks for having me here. Our frustrated bishops.
Myself, basically.
We always say that.
It depends.
A well-concerted effort.
Perhaps I can reiterate.
My greatest beefsteak. Iba na, iba pa na.
Welcome back at the forefront. And still joining our discussion is Professor Coronacion, head of UST Political Science Department, and Professor Torre, head of the UE Political Science Department. And let's find out the assessment of our political scientists regarding the contrasting survey results of Pulse Asia, Publicus, and Tangere. So, when we look at the survey results, and I think this is more tricky because it relates to several senatorial candidates, but they really vary. Well, what remains consistent, again, is Erwin Tulfo, Ben Tulfo, Tito Soto, Senator Ping Lacson. They're always in the top 5. But the other candidates, they really vary a lot. So let's talk about the background of the survey firms. Publicus was founded just about a year ago. Is that correct? In 2023? And we have Professor Malutikia and Lilibeth Amatong as one of their founders. Correct me if I'm wrong, if there's any details here. But how reliable is Publicus?
Well, first of all, I think Publicus has been around, but I don't know if it was formally established in 2023. But in our community, we have known Publicus for quite some time, and that it's headed by Malutikia.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm looking at their brand. It does say established in 2003.
Oh, yeah.
So it's been around for a long time. But have they always been also issuing surveys?
I think only recently.
It's only recently that...
Not as early as 2003, so only recently.
And why do you think it's been criticized by personalities like former Representative Lito Atienza as biased and politically motivated?
Well,
Tumawa na si Professor Dennis. Okay.
For one, Malutikia is very vocal about her not really in so many words support, but strong opposition on the part of the administration, and very sympathetic to the Vice President and the Dutertes. So, for example, if people knew about her affiliation to Publicus, sometimes, of course, in the community, and you tend to question basically the credibility, since the owner or people involved with regard to the affiliation is very much sympathetic to a particular group or a political personality, for that matter.
So in this case, we are looking at the recent senatorial preference surveys from top 1 to 24. And here you have Doc Willie Ong ranking second, which is unusual compared to the other surveys. Sometimes Doc Willie Ong enters the top 12, but not as high as number 2.
Yeah.
So what do you think accounts for the difference?
Well, for one, I think it's the methodology. Although most survey firms use the same methods, they vary in the details. Yeah.
Like what type of details? And are they required to disclose that publicly?
Yeah, I think so. Details in terms of, say, for example, are they, how random are the respondents? In terms of choosing the respondents, how random is it? as well as the distribution of the respondents. Is there a heavy concentration in a certain region? So those things definitely affect the results.
And do you think that it's also confusing for respondents to have two Willies in the survey? You have Doc Willie Ong and then Willie Revillame. Or hindi naman ganun ka-confusing
Hindi
ba?
naman. At tingin ko kaya siya nag-number 2 si Doc Willie is because of the news about his cancer. And despite that, parang he's still willing to serve the public. So that I consider that as a sympathy vote.
And looking at the Publicus survey, you have Senator Bato de la Rosa ranking 8th, whereas in Pulse Asia, he's only 13, and in Tangere, he didn't make it to the top 12. What are your thoughts on this?
Again, that would depend on the methodology, Attorney Karen. For example, that would depend also on the class. Like for example, SWS and Pulse, they vary in terms of the socioeconomic standing of the people. As what Dr. Coronacion mentioned, it's how random it is, or how it was actually conducted. Plus the fact that in terms of the percentage per region, so that it would give the whole representation as much as possible.
And in the Publicus survey, you have Attorney Vic Rodriguez here, and I'm just curious, is that normal to have someone? I'm not aware that he filed for a certificate of candidacy as a senatorial candidate. So is that normal to still have a name of someone who's not really a candidate to be here? Or did he file to be independent?
Well, I think he filed a,
he did?
He did.
Okay. So normally, pag ganito na tayo kalapit, after the filing of candidacies, the names you see here are really those that filed a certificate of
That's
candidacy
right.
Yes,
for
that's right.
senator.
And
Okay.
in most cases, survey firms include in their questionnaires a list of candidates.
Yeah.
So the respondents are just going to choose from among these names in the list.
Okay, so they won't include anyone who's not running anymore.
Yes.
That's right.
And Tangere, again, this is another survey firm that came out with a senatorial preference survey recently. But a lot of people are not as familiar with Tangere compared to brands like Pulse Asia. Can you tell us the background of Tangere in terms of reliability? Is this perceived to be reliable in the field of political scientists?
Well, Tangere, I think only does its surveys before the elections, but not during ordinary times. That's why people hardly recall Tangere.
But they do conduct surveys for elections over
That's
the
right.
years. Hindi sila bago.
Unlike Pulse Asia, na periodically, every quarter,
They do.
they release the results of their surveys.
And for them, for Pulse Asia, they also have approval ratings, and then even top of mind issues among Filipinos,
Yes,
right?
that's
Like
right.
they come out with surveys like that.
I think, Attorney Karen, if I may, the thing about Pulse and SWS, the miss is that the recall in terms of establishing their credibility, because they do surveys not only during the elections, but for example, as what you have said, there are basically, they conduct surveys, for example, in terms of poverty ratings, approval ratings. So extraordinarily, even if there is no elections, they're very consistent. So it gives people, the idea of, them being credible, especially during the times of, pandemic. During the times of the pandemic, Okta was very much at the forefront of which they were able to get, credibility.
And Professor Eric, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier, where this 2025 midterm elections would be a validation of the president's endorsement power. Do you think that when they planned their slate, they were also looking at surveys to determine who are the strong candidates? Because we have Tito Soto and Senator Ping Lacson that are clearly strong candidates, but they were not allies of the president because, in fact, they ran as president and vice president against President Bongbong Marcos and VP Sara back in 2022. So is that something that is part of the political strategy to put strong candidates in your slate kahit hindi mo alay?
Yeah, well, definitely, it's really a strategy on the part of the administration. It's the winnability and the perception that you're actually, you have formidable candidates. For example, despite they ran against the president during the 2022 elections, getting them in your slate gives you a perception that, hey, they align themselves with the president. So they're really the administration is kind of really strong in terms of getting these candidates to be part of their team.
And Dr. Dennis, considering the differences in the methodology which account for the differences also in survey results, how should Filipinos use surveys? And do you believe that this can create a bandwagon effect?
Well, for us in the political science community, regardless of the background of the survey firms, we still take a look at these survey results, because after all, these are data, and political scientists base their analysis on data. So, in fact, we can get an insight based on the differing results, diverse results coming from this. If we're going to look at the case of Senator Bato de la Rosa, if there's anything that we can get from these results regarding Senator Bato's case, it means that he is in danger at the moment, because the results may still change as time goes by. So, yun ang ma-establish doon, na nasa precarious situation siya, and he has to do good. As a strategist, my advice for him would be to do something about his image, because I think that his image was damaged by the recent controversies.
And for candidates, do they use this to help with their campaign?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much, Professor Dennis Coronacion, and thank you, Professor Eric Torre. The decline in the approval and trust ratings of the President and the Vice President are an indication that most Filipinos are aware of the goings-on in the country's political scene. Rather than finding excuses for the decline in their ratings, the country's top government officials should consider this as a timely wake-up call to improve their governance and make themselves trustworthy to the Filipino public. As for senatorial preference surveys, all leave us with more questions rather than answers. Be timely informed, be insightful of the news. Always stay at the forefront. Join us again tomorrow in a special episode a day before Christmas. This is Attorney Karen Jimeno. Thank you for spending your hour with us.